You would recall that in the last discussion that we had, we talked about the history of state intervention in business, how the various policies have evolved over the years regarding the state's intervention in the business affairs in the business world. In this session, we'll be discussing the rationale. Why basically does the state intervene in business, or let's say, as I've told you in the last session also, why exactly on behalf of the state, the governments, maybe the central government or the state governments, do they intervene in the business affairs? Do they interfere in the business affairs? What is the logic behind state intervention? What is a rationale? That is what we are going to discuss now. See, the first reason why the government on behalf of the state intervenes in business affairs, tries to regulate them, is to fulfill the constitutional mandate. I hope you remember from our discussion of the earlier sessions that the Constitution of India guarantees some fundamental rights to every citizen, and there are some directive principles of state policy also which are not justiciable. They are non-justiciable, but the governments are expected to keep those principles in their mind while devising any policy or formulating any law. For example, there is a fundamental right against exploitation. To ensure that the workers are not exploited, the right is not guaranteed only to the workers, but it is guaranteed to all the citizens. So when the government start applying this particular fundamental right to the business affairs, now they have to guarantee that the workers are not exploited by the management, and that is why bonded labor, badhuha mazduri, has always been illegal in India, because the constitutional mandate was that the citizens should have the right against exploitation, and that is why government came up with a regulation that bonded labor is not going to be allowed anymore, right? And this was the basic reason why government actually came up with a legislation which has an impact on the business world. So in a way, it was interfering with the business affairs so that it could fulfill the mandate given in the constitution. Again, for example, you have talked about the directive principles of state policy, and then there was a directive principle which actually talked about encouraging the workers' participation in management, and that was what made the government came up with provisions so that the various firms, various manufacturing industries can have shop floor committees, joint management committees, wherein both the management as well as the workers can come together and decide and make a decision, make a call on various issues faced by the company, by the organization. So that was a directive principle, and to give shape to that directive principle, to bring that directive principle into reality, the government came up with this provision that the various manufacturing industries which are there, they have to have shop floor councils and joint management committees. So the basic idea is that many times government intervene in a business because they have to fulfill the constitutional mandate. Again, and the other reason why governments intervene in the business affairs, and governments also at times set up their own enterprises, the public sector enterprises. I hope you remember what public sector enterprises are. Those enterprises which are owned and controlled and managed by the government. They are owned by the government. For example, we have got so many PSU banks, SBI, Union Bank of India, Bank of Baroda, Punjab National Bank, Dena Bank, Vijaya Bank, UCO Bank. These all are basically PSU banks because the majority ownership is with the government. Now there are many sectors in the economy where the private sector, where the private entrepreneurs, they don't want to invest. The reason is because these sectors entail a lot of risk for the businesses and they have long gestation period. So those sectors of the economy which are very very risky, naturally the private sector, the private capital, the private entrepreneur would not want to enter those sectors of the economy. And what will happen then? Those sectors of the economy would remain underdeveloped. Likewise, if there's a long gestation period in a particular sector of economy, for example, I'll let you know first of all what gestation is. Gestation is the time gap between the point when your project starts, when you start incurring expenditures, incurring expenses in your project, and the time when your project starts earning you some revenue. I'll give you an example to make you understand this thing better. Let's say if I want to construct a 10-kilometer stretch of road, so it may so happen that my project would start today, and I'll start investing in that project from today itself, right? And maybe within next 7 to 8 months I'll be able to construct the road, and once the roads have been constructed, then I'll erect a toll plaza, a toll barrier there, and I'll start collecting toll from people who are using that road. So after 8 months I have been able to earn something from the project, though I had started investing today, but I'll start earning only after 8 months, which means the gestation period is 8 months. But now compare this with the gestation period in case of big dams, hydroelectric projects. Don't you think hydroelectric projects would take maybe 2 years, 3 years, at times 5 years, 8 years, 10 years to come up? So the gestation period would be very very long. It could be 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, 12, 15 years also. Likewise is the case for big infrastructure projects like ports, airports, highways. So naturally these are those sectors of the economy which have a long gestation period, which means if the private capital invests in these sectors, they will only be able to earn something from that project after a considerable gap of time, after a considerable time period. Is this okay? And naturally in such cases they would not want to invest, because they have to invest today and they would be earning maybe in distant future. So naturally there's a lot of uncertainty, and the money is getting locked for a longer period of time. They would never want to invest. Many of them would not want to invest in such sectors of the economy or in such projects. And if the private sector does not invest in these projects, what would happen then? Don't you think these sectors of the economy would lag behind? And then the government will have to intervene, and that is why the states intervene. Now they set up their own enterprises in such sectors of the economy which generally have a long gestation period or which entail a huge risk, so that even if the private capital is not there, they can compensate for the lack of private capital, and that particular sector of the economy does not lag behind. So this is the reason why government set up so many steel manufacturing units back in 1950s and 60s, because steel manufacturing takes a lot of time, is risky also, and the setting up of the plant, the production plant, it takes a lot of time. So the gestation period is also long, and that is why not many private players were interested to enter the iron and steel production at that point of time. So government decided that they will reserve the iron and steel sector for themselves, and they started setting up iron and steel mills in 50s and 60s in the central part of the country. So this was the reason. So this is another rationale for state intervention. Wherever the private capital is missing, private capital is not present in sufficient volume, therein the government would intervene, the state would intervene to make up for the shortfall in the private capital. Right? Now the other reason why the states have to intervene in business is that many times public goods have to be provided to the population, to the citizenry. Now what do we mean by public goods? Let's first of all understand what do we mean basically by public goods, right? So see, public goods, let us first take a look at these examples: the defense, law and order, roads and parks. Now you would be better able to understand the characteristics of public goods that we have discussed here. See, public goods are those goods if they're consumed by one, there would be no compromise with the consumption by somebody else. I'll give you an example. Let's say you have bought a packet of chips and you have bought it for the whole family, but you have consumed it all by yourself. You have consumed it all. Don't you think the consumption by you actually reduce the scope of consumption by other members of your family, right? So that is not a public good. On the other hand, let's say in your colony a park has come up, right? Now a park has come up in your colony and you decide to take a walk there on the particular park. So you go to the park in the mornings and you take a walk so that you can remain fit. Now, does that mean that since you have already consumed the facility that was being provided by the park, does that mean that nobody else can also utilize the same facility? If you have utilized the park facility, nobody else can also. So whether or not you utilize the park, it is not going to have an impact on its utilization by somebody else. So even if you consume, whether you don't consume, it is not going to have an impact on consumption by others. It is not going to reduce the amount that others can consume. Do you understand my point? So this is a characteristic and attribute of public goods. Now I'll give you another example. Suppose you know about the entity which maintains law and order. It is the police department, right? Now the government will have to spend money on maintaining a police department. The government spends money on maintaining defense forces and constructing roads, highways, and again in constructing parks so that people can go there for a leisure walk, right? Now suppose somebody has stolen your mobile. What will you do? You'll go to the police and you'll lodge an FIR, right? You'll lodge a report that your mobile has been stolen. Now since you are using the law and order facilities being provided by the government or being provided by the police department, does that mean, since you have consumed the law and order facilities, does that mean nobody else can go to the police department because they are serving you, they are busy serving you? It's not like that. Anybody can go there and anybody can get served by the police department. So whether or not you make use of the services provided by the police department, it is going to have no impact on the utilization of those services by other people in your area. So that is what a public good is. If you are walking on a road, just because you are walking on the road, there is no less road available for others to walk on. They can also make use of the same infrastructure. This is a public good. This is fine. And since this is a public good, in public goods what also happens is, please understand, in public goods, the cost of excluding those who don't pay is very, very high. For example, if there's a park in your colony, there might be some people who would be frequenting the park, they might be using the facilities there, there might be others who might not be. But don't you think it is going to be very costly to recover the charges for walking in the park or for jogging in the park from those who are using it? It is going to be very, very costly. Don't you think it would be very, very costly to find out who all have used the NH125 and to make them pay for their use? It is going to be very, very costly, and it is very difficult for you to exclude those, to find out those who are not paying for the service. So what you do in essence is, basically you charge all the users at the same rate. I'll give you an example. Suppose you have got a bike, you pay road tax for that. Somebody else has also got a scooty, he is also paying road tax. The amount is same for you. If both of you are using the same kind of a vehicle, both of you are using a two-wheeler, so the road tax that you'll have to pay is the same in both the cases. However, one person may be using the road extensively every single day. On the other hand, the other person may not at all be using the road. Once in a month or once in 2 months, he's actually using the road. He's actually taking his bike out and traveling on that road. So don't you think it is going to be difficult for us to charge them differentially, to go for differential pricing for them? It is going to be very, very difficult for us. We would not be able to have differential pricing which is based on use. Somebody who is using more intensively, can we ask him to pay more? And somebody who is using less intensively, can we ask him to pay less? It's going to be difficult. I'm not saying it is impossible, but very, very difficult, very, very impractical, right? And very, very costly also. So these kind of goods are called public goods. These kind of services or goods are called public goods. Is this fine? So again, exact usage cannot be determined. Who among your neighbors is making the most use of the road that runs in front of your colony? Don't you think it is going to be difficult for us to determine that? Which biker or which car owner is using the road more intensively and which ones are not at all using it? Don't you think it is going to be difficult for us to determine this? Since it is difficult for us to determine this, we cannot find out what is the difference in usage. We also cannot have different prices for different users depending on their usage. Now, this is a characteristic of public good. Somebody who is going to police again and again to lodge different complaints, and some other person who has all his life never gone to a police station because he had never felt the need to lodge any complaint. Nothing of that sort has happened with him. Can we price our services at different levels for both of them? Can we ask the two of them to pay different charges depending on their usage? The person who has been to police station every year or two, can we ask him to pay more? It's just not possible, just not practical. And that is why these are public goods, right? On the other hand, let's say if you are traveling in a bus, it is easy for me to determine whether or not you are traveling in the bus, and I can charge you for that. If you are traveling 150 kilometers, I'll charge you more. If you are traveling only 20 kilometers, I'll charge you less. So these are not public goods. So wherever public goods are there, the private sectors generally would not want to invest in those sectors of economy which provide public goods and public services. Why? Because of the reasons which have been mentioned here. Number one, you don't know who has used how much. You don't know which customer is using how much. Can you find out? It's going to be very, very difficult, very, very impractical, not feasible. And since you cannot determine the exact usage, you cannot go for different pricing also, right? And this would mean that the private sector would not be able to earn by providing these kind of public goods and services. So then the private sector would not want to invest in these kind of goods and services, and naturally it would be left for the state to provide these kind of goods and services. So who maintains the police force? It is the state, maybe the central or the state government. Who provides for the upkeep of the defense forces? It is the state. Who provides for the construction of roads? It is generally the state, because they are all public goods. And private capital is simply not interested in providing public goods, entering this particular sector, because they simply cannot assess, find out who is using how much, and simply cannot accordingly go for a differential pricing regime which is based on use intensity. So they simply don't want to invest in such sectors, and it is now left for the state to provide these kind of services. So this is another reason why, despite not willing to, the state will have to provide these services. In a way, state will actually be providing these goods and services, and it would be charging all the people regardless of their usage intensity. A nominal rate would be charged from every single individual, every single family, every single user, regardless of its usage intensity, and this job would be done by the state, right? Again, so to ensure efficient utilization of scarce resources. Many a time some of the resources are scarce. For example, when we attained our freedom at that point of time, we had limited supply of iron and steel, and iron and steel are very very important ingredients, be it construction industry, be it the infrastructure, because if you have to, for example, construct a building, you may have to use iron, for example. To construct a bridge, a highway, there also iron is going to be used. So these are very very crucial inputs in all these industries and very very important for the development of the country. Now, if you leave it to the whims of the private sector, what will happen? The private sector, rather than using the iron steel for constructing roads or for constructing various bridges, what will be the private sector doing? It will invest in using that iron steel. It will invest in consumer durables industry and sell these products to the customers and earn its profits. And this way what will happen, the scarce resources would be frittered away on those needs which were not basic. They would be frittered away in production of consumer durables like fridges, like washing machines. And this is just not acceptable, specifically if you have resource scarcity. If the resources are not sufficient, then what would you do? Then you would keep a tab on how much resources are being used by a particular firm. You would go for some kind of a licensing regime. I hope you remember our discussion on the IDRA, Industries Development Regulation Act 1951, which actually came up with the licensing regime so that the scarce raw material could be used wisely. So here the state had to intervene by coming up with this particular law, the Industries Development Regulation Act, because the resources were scarce, right? So whenever there is a resource scarcity, it is for the state to come up with laws to determine who all would be using these resources, which all industries will be using these resources, and what would be the amount that they can use. I hope you recall our discussion in the IDRA Act. So there, how much can you produce, what would be the volumes of production, everything was used to be specified in the license that were given away to these firms, so that the state has perfect control and regulation of the amount of raw materials, scarce raw materials that are getting used, right? Then to create conditions for balanced regional development. See, most of our country, in many parts of our country, you would find generally they are less developed than the urban centers and the urban towns and then the metropolitan cities. So the objective of state intervention also is to create conditions so that all the parts of the country, all the regions, they have the opportunity to grow and develop at the same pace, which is known as the balanced regional development. Now if you allow private sector to have its say, what will happen? Private sector would want to set up their industries wherever they find it to be the most profitable, wherever they find it most profitable. So they would set up their industries near the urban areas, because the prominent consumption centers are the urban areas. Delhi and Mumbai, the population is more than 1 crore. Uttarakhand is also 1 crore, but if you look at the area, Delhi and Mumbai are far smaller than Uttarakhand. So naturally, rather than trying to set up their enterprises, their production facilities in Uttarakhand, they would want to set up their production facilities somewhere near Mumbai or somewhere near Delhi, so that they can sell their products to the customers who are residing in these cities. So in such a case, what will happen? We will have lopsided development. Some parts of the country will develop, the other parts will not. And so to prevent this from happening and to ensure that there is a balanced regional development, the state has to intervene. And how does the state intervene? Number one, I'll give an example. If you look at the banks, what happens? If you look at the private sector banks, you look at Citibank, you would not find Citibanks operating in rural areas. But if you look at SBI and the other public sector banks, be it the cooperative banks, be it the regional rural banks, Kshetri Gramin banks, like the Uttarakhand Gramin Bank or be it the various other banks, you would find that they are operating even in rural areas also. Because, and these are all public sector enterprises, public sector banks, because the objective is not just to earn profit, but to ensure that the people in all parts of the country, they have access to credit, udhar, so that they can use that credit to invest in a profitable business enterprise. And this would ensure a balanced regional development of all the parts of the country. This is fine. If you look at what BSNL used to do you know that generally most of the telecom companies, they were against investing in rural areas, so they would not provide their services in the rural areas. The reason is very very simple. Rural areas population is less, then the population is scattered also, so you will have to erect too many towers, and then even then per tower usage would be much low, so they generally were averse to investing in rural areas. So what did the government do at that point of time? What did the state do? State asked BSNL to do this, because you could not have left the rural parts of the country behind. You had to ensure that they also have access to mobile telecommunication technology. They also are able to use that for various productive purposes. So it was left to BSNL to create telecommunication infrastructure in rural areas. Is this okay? Likewise, if you look at the private sector and if you look at the private taxis that are running, on what routes, which routes do they run? They run on the most profitable route. So you might find them plying on Pithoragarh to Haldwani route, because so many customers are there, so many passengers are there who traverse that particular route. They would, however, never be plying on a route which is less profitable, because the customers are not there or the customers don't have that kind of paying capacity. So in such places, what will happen? The Road Transport Corporation of Uttarakhand, which is a state government enterprise in the sense that it is assisted and it is provided funding by the government. Now they will provide their services in these kind of areas, because the state wants all the areas to develop. They don't want some rural areas, backward areas to be left behind. They want them also to have access to transportation facilities, but the private capital is not going to provide these services to them because it is not profitable for them to do that. So what will they do? The private sector is never going to ply on these routes which are not profitable. Think of any remote village in Pithoragarh district. You would not find any private taxi plying on that route, but the government might run their buses on that particular route. The reason is they want balanced development of the whole of the country, all the parts of the country, and that is why the state actually starts providing services by having their own state road transport corporations, Parivahan Nigams, or by setting up banks belonging to the PSU sector, or maybe by, as I discuss this particular example of BSNL, by asking BSNL to erect mobile telecommunication infrastructure in rural areas. To attain rapid development, many a times the government has to ensure that there is rapid development. For example, if you talk about the agriculture sector, you know that so many people in India are dependent on agriculture. Almost 50% and a little more than that, if I am not wrong, of our population is still dependent on agriculture. So the government would want rapid growth in the agriculture sector, because that would mean the people who are engaged in agriculture, they also have the opportunity to increase their income levels, improve their standard of living. So what will government do? The government will have to intervene. And how would the government intervene? The government would come up with schemes which help the farmers improve their productivity. The government would set up the Pantnagar University, the Pantnagar Agriculture University. I hope you know that Pantnagar Agriculture University is the oldest agriculture university in India. So government has set this up so that there could be proper scientific researches conducted with the focus on improving the farm yields, with the focus on coming up with the best quality seeds, with the focus on coming up with the best irrigation technologies. And this know-how can then be made available to the farmers, so that farmers can use these techniques and can improve their yields, can improve their productivity, and can improve their income levels. So For this, what did the government do? Government not only set up the Agriculture Pantnagar University, but also provided it so many facilities. Right, now we'll take some more examples. For example, in some of the sectors of the economy, what happens, please understand, the government sets the floor price. Floor price is the basic minimum price that will have to be paid for that commodity. I'll give an example. The example is the minimum support price regime for our various agriculture commodities. So government announces the minimum support price for many agriculture commodities in the beginning of the cropping cycle. So for example, paddy is sown somewhere around June, July. So they would announce their minimum support price before the cropping cycle begins. And why are they doing that? So that the farmers who are engaged in agriculture, they can be assured of a certain minimum earnings that they can have if they grow a particular crop. What happens in basically minimum selling price regime is MSP regime. What happens? Basically what happens is that the government sets up a floor price, and government assures the farmers that the government will be ready to purchase their produce at that particular price, which they will call the MSP or the minimum support price. Now if the farmer is not able to sell his produce somewhere else, what will he do? He can always come back to the government and sell his produce to the government. You understand the point? So in this sense, the government is assuring the farmer that, okay boss, if you are not able to sell your product, don't worry, we will buy it from you, and this is the minimum that you would be able to earn. And why are we doing this? Why is government coming up with such kind of a regulation? And in a way government is interfering with the business. Why? Because the prices of the various crops that the government has set here under the MSP regime, they will also determine the market prices of that crop. They will also determine at what price the companies like Nestle or companies like Britannia who use wheat, for example, or who use various other crops, at what price they will have to purchase from the farmers, because the prices set by the government will also impact the prices in the market of that particular commodity, right? So ultimately this will impact the various businesses, because if they offer prices which are lower than the government's MSP, then nobody is going to sell their products, sell their crop to them. So they would have to pay a higher price to the farmer to obtain raw material supply from them, to obtain their crop, so that they can use it further to produce biscuits. So the government's initiative would actually bring about a change in the market dynamics. It would impact the markets, and in this sense the government is intervening in the business affairs. But the whole objective of this kind of intervention is to ensure that the farmer community gets sufficient remuneration for its hard work, for its produce, for its crop that it is selling in the market, and so that they are not exploited in the market. So this is the main idea behind coming up with these kind of MSP regimes, minimum support price regimes. So we are trying to, the state basically wants the farmer community also to develop. The state wants to increase the farm incomes. This is fine. Again, the government talks about the backward area subsidies also. Now this subsidy is given away to those firms which set up their manufacturing units in backward areas. Now these backward areas would be the ones which have been categorized as such by the government, be it the central or the state government. And if a particular firm is setting its unit in that particular backward area, then it would be provided some kind of a subsidy. Why is government doing this? So that these backward areas can also develop. We talked about this here also in the balanced regional development point that we discussed a little while ago. So the idea is to attain rapid development of these backward areas also. Again, government provides export incentives. So government provides various incentives to the exporters. Why is the government doing this? So that the export sector can grow. What will happen if our export sector grows? I hope you would be able to recall our earlier discussion. What happens if the export sector grows? We will export more and we will earn more of dollars and other foreign currency, and our forex reserve, foreign exchange reserve, will increase. This is fine. So this is the objective of providing export incentives. some kind of incentives to exporters. We want our export sector to grow. For the overall development of the economy, it is very, very important for our export sector to grow. So we are giving them some kind of incentives. Is this okay? So that the exporters are motivated to export more and to more number of destinations, more number of countries. So the whole idea behind these kind of interventions is, now here the intervention was in the form of incentives which the government provided to the exporters, right? Here the intervention was in the form of subsidy which was provided to those firms which were setting up their units in the backward areas. Here it was in a very different sense. Again, I talked about the provision of public goods by the state here. Here it was very different. Government actually maintained a full army so that they can defend the country, they can provide these services to the citizens. In some other places, for example, I talked about the bank, the intervention was a different kind. There the government actually set up wholly owned enterprises or partially owned enterprises, PSU banks. They set up their own entities which are owned by them. So they set up their own entities to operate in those sectors of the economy. So the state intervention can take so many different forms, right? Now, to diversify revenue incomes. Okay, now let us talk about one relatively more selfish motive of the government. Many times what happens is, please understand, governments earn their revenue. How do they earn their revenue? They actually earn from the taxes that we pay, be it the GST, the indirect tax regime that we have, the goods and services tax, be it the income tax that those who are employed they are paying, be it the corporate tax that the industries are paying, the firms are paying. Now, this is how the government earns. But then if a government also has set up some public sector enterprises who are operating in different sectors of the economy. For example, in India, government has set up public sector enterprises in oil refining. So, for example, we have got Indian Oil Corporation, which is a public sector enterprise, and this is basically an entity which actually imports crude oil and then it refines it to produce petrol and diesel and other such products and then market these products, right? Now, since this is a PSU and this is owned by the government, what will they do with their profits? What happens when a company earns profit? It can either retain it so that the profit can be used whenever there is a requirement to expand in future, or maybe to expand into new markets, the money would be required. So they might keep their profits safe with them. This is called retained earnings, so that they can use it at a future date for a future purpose, right? On the other hand, some of the companies can also divide the profit among their owners, because ultimately the company belongs to the owners. So what will they do? Depending on how many shares a particular individual owns, they would allocate the profit among the various shareholders, and this is what we know as dividends, right? So dividends are given away to owners or the shareholders in proportion of the volume of shares that they hold. So if somebody owns 2% shares of a particular firm and some other person owns 10% shares of a particular firm, the dividend which will have to be given away to the latter, the one who owns 10% shares of the firm, will be 5 times the dividend given away to somebody who is owning just 2%. So basically dividends are basically proportional allocation of profits to the shareholders. Now let's come back to our example that I had taken a little while ago. Since IOC is a public sector enterprise, and if it is profitable, what will it do? Yes, of course, it may retain some of its earning for use in future, for some investment which is planned in future. But then it may also want to allocate the profit to the shareholders. And in this case, who is the shareholder? The government. So what will the government receive from IOC? The government will receive dividends. Is this okay? And don't you think this would increase the revenue earnings for the government? It would increase the government's earnings, and in a way it would also diversify government's earnings. Diversify means now government will have more than one source to earn from. Earlier government was only relying on tax earnings, but now they can rely on the dividends which are going to be paid to it by the public sector enterprises which are owned by the government. So do you understand? So this in a sense is diversifying the government's revenue income. Now please understand one more thing. Like in the current crisis, you might have seen that the government's tax collections have decreased. Why? Because there was a lockdown for almost 2 months, no economic activity, bare minimum economic activity only could take place. So naturally, less amount of economic activity would mean less earnings for the firms, and less earnings would mean less tax revenue for the government. However, if they have dividend to fall back on, if they are being provided dividend by companies like IOC, by PSU banks, naturally they will be able to compensate for the loss in the tax revenue. So in this sense, there is a diversification. So that is what we mean by diversification, right? To prevent monopolies, many times government owned enterprises enter a particular sector of the economy to ensure that no private monopolies exist in that particular sector. What is a monopoly? One seller and so many buyers. And if that one seller is a private firm, then what might be the next step of that particular private firm? A private firm who has a monopoly in a particular sector is very likely to exploit that monopoly power. And what will they do? They will start increasing their prices. They will start providing inferior quality of goods to their customers, because the customer does not have any choice. He cannot go to any other seller because there is just one seller. That is why it's a monopoly. So in such cases, the customers will be duped. We have had a discussion on this while we were discussing MRTP and the Consumer Protection Act. So in such sectors of the economy where it is likely that the private sectors may acquire monopoly control, the government sets up its own enterprises owned by the government itself. They are set up in these sectors of the economy so that the monopoly situation can be done away with. Now, since for the customers, earlier there was just one supplier, one private firm which was supplying the goods, but now there is government, public sector enterprise also which is supplying the goods. There are less chances, less probability of the customers being duped by the private player who was earlier the monopoly power in that particular sector of the economy, right? To ensure social welfare also, at times the government intervenes. I hope you remember the Kisan Samman Nidhi, 6,000 to be provided to farmers with a land holding of less than 2 hectares in 3 different installments, so 2,000, 2,000, 2,000. This is a social welfare scheme. And how is this intervening in the business? What will the farmers do with this money that they have, this extra 6,000 that they are now having in a particular year because the government is providing them this amount? Don't you think they are going to buy something using this 6,000? They might go for better quality seeds. They might go for better education for their children. They might invest in consuming more nutritious food. Don't you think it's a good news for those businesses who are selling nutritious food in the market? It is a good news for private schools, because it is likely that this 6,000 extra that the farmer family is earning, they might want to use it to send their children to a private school for better education. So in a way, this move of the government will impact the businesses also. There is a speculation, it is actually expected that this 6,000 subsidy that is being provided under the Kisan Samman Nidhi will increase the demand for various types of goods in the rural markets. So this is how this move by the government is impacting the businesses also. It is impacting the business world also. Now we have taken another example of old age pension. The government provides old age pension. Now this is what I am trying to tell you actually. Old age pension is provided to people who are above 60 years of age and they belong to BPL families. The pension is nominal, almost 1,000 per month. But don't you think in itself it can be a big amount for somebody who is very, very poor? And rupees 1,000 extra means that he may be able to purchase some more items than what he used to do earlier when he was not having access to such kind of a pension or such kind of a subsidy. naturally this would also impact the business world. Food subsidy is being provided. Food subsidy is being provided to BPL families, APL families. What happens? Food subsidy is being provided so that the people can have access to food and there are no malnutrition deaths. There are no hunger deaths. But then what will happen if people have food and they don't have to spend on food because food is available at a subsidized cost? What will happen? They will do what? They will use the money available with them on other kind of products or services to improve their standard of living. And that is what the people do. So in a way, it may so happen that people who have access to food subsidy, they may start buying more fruits, right? Because they are being provided cereals at a subsidized price by the government. So they may decide to buy, let's say, FMCG products like a toothpaste. Don't you think the sales of the toothpaste will increase in such markets where this kind of food subsidy is being provided to the poor sections of the society? So this is how a welfare scheme by the government is also impacting the business world. Now did you see this particular picture? There are chimneys from which smoke is emanating. Now the government has come up with various laws. The laws are being implemented by the government, which ensures that the firms which are operating such enterprise, such manufacturing units, they don't pollute the environment. Why is government coming up with this kind of regulation for the businesses? So that the businesses may not impact the environment and the environment is not damaged and there is no threat to the health of the people, of the citizenry. And for that they have basically devised many such laws. For example, you might have come across laws like air pollution, laws related to air pollution and soil pollution, water pollution also. So these are the various reasons why governments intervene. The state actually intervenes in business affairs, and it is on the behalf of the state, the governments intervene in the business affairs. We'll continue our discussion on the state intervention in business affairs in the next session also. Thank you very much.